Welcome to the first of the YPOMPOD, Your Places or Mine podcasts, actually from a particular site. We're all sitting in the churchyard at Geddington, and you may occasionally hear the distant sound of a lawnmower or something like that. But I'm John Goodall, I'm the Architecture Editor of Country Life.
And I'm Clive Aslet, I'm a visiting professor at Cambridge, and we are very, very lucky to be joined by the wonderful Alice Loxton.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honoured to be a guest.
And so this is the most wonderful place to do this on location first ever YPOMPOD, because not only is Geddington beautiful, but it has a great resonance for me, because I used to have a little cottage here, and I could see the thing we're going to be talking about from our tiny little cottage garden. So this is deeply emotional, and also it is the most glorious day to be doing it. It is absolutely wonderful. But we're very, very lucky, because not only do we have Alice here as a person contributing so much, but she has written a book on this subject, which is, what's the title, Alice?
The title is Eleanor, and it's all about a story which I came across quite recently, I suppose, but I was surprised that I didn't know more about it, and I was surprised that it wasn't more famous. And that story is the Eleanor crosses.
Very famous in Geddington.
Very famous in Geddington, yes. The people of Geddington were very pleased to hear that I was writing about this. And it's a story about Eleanor of Castile, who was the queen of Edward I, and she died in 1290. And she died in a village near Lincoln called Harby, and it was a sudden death, a kind of unexpected death, and that's why she died in this quite remote little place. It's thought that she was too ill to make it to Lincoln. So it's this dramatic death of Queen Eleanor. And then after this, they have to carry her body first to Lincoln, where she's embalmed and they remove her viscera. And then they carry her body all the way to London on this almost 200-mile journey. And following this, Edward, who is so grief-stricken, erects a series of monuments, of stone monuments. There are 12 of them in total, which are at every stage of that journey. And those are these magnificent architectural art. People don't really know what it is. It's kind of the first time that these monuments have been created, and they are known as the Eleanor crosses. And so the book that I've written is that I've followed that journey by foot. I followed it on the dates that they originally did it in the medieval period, and was sort of tracing the remains of the Eleanor crosses, but also what's happened to so many of them since.
Gosh, but to be a Geddingtonist about it, can I just say that although we don't have the biggest cross, it is the best preserved.
It is. It is.
And the other thing, which is an incredibly romantic story, isn't it? But Eleanor and Edward obviously had this great affection. I think she was on, is it right, am I right in saying that she was on the way to Scotland as the Hammer of the Scots? He was hammering away in Scotland, and she was en route to join him. Is that why she was slightly older, sort of up the A1. No, sorry. I
don't think that's... right. I mean, she's travelling around her manors. I think it's one of her own manors where she dies. And it is worth saying that she and Edward, she's 13, he's 15 when they're married in Spain, that the marriage brings to Edward I the potential through her of property in France, the county of Ponthieu, that she claims through her mother, which is really important. It's one of the things that's celebrated, in fact, on the crosses. And he is clearly grief-stricken. I mean, she does travel, you're right, she travels to Acre on crusade with Edward, and Edward nearly dies, but he has an operation. But I think
she shuts the venom.
Well, I'm about to say
that's the great story.
Yeah, the relationship is very romanticised, and indeed, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that when she actually dies, she's deeply unpopular as a queen, because she enriches herself beyond the level of any previous English queen by taking property, taking debts that Christians owed to Jews. And because only Jews could charge interest, and so lots of people took out debts with Jews, and she took the debts over, and then used her officials basically to get the land that was laid down as the surety of the debt. So she acquired huge quantities of property, and I think at her death is very unpopular, but then her whole story is romanticised. I think is that fair to say, Alice?
Yeah, I mean, it's debated on the unpopularity front, and there are some reports of people criticising her when she's alive, but of course, there are many of the records of her life don't survive. So I think you can overly read into the surviving sources, I suppose. What I was interested about is what kind of woman must she have been, and what kind of relationship must Edward and Eleanor had that these series of monuments were built. And I think I'd be right in saying, John, that these were pretty magnificent things to build.
Yes.
And we're so used to seeing monuments and amazing structures today and huge buildings, but they would have been pretty amazing for the people of the 1290s, and they were built in the years after her death. And there is debate about whether, or there's something to think about, is this a symbol of Edward's love for Eleanor? Is this great romantic gesture? Is this the Taj Mahal of England's story? Or is this something is this a kind of propaganda move to make, to rewrite her story, to put it back on the map? But to be honest, I think, people seem to celebrate Eleanor for the medieval period, and they celebrated the crosses, and they were these very important structures on the big roads towards London. And I suppose that if she was so incredibly unpopular, they probably wouldn't have survived.
Yes, well, I suppose it is true to say also that whatever her personality and so forth, there is no doubt that Edward I is very fond of her. Mm-hmm. They're fond of each other. They have, I think, 16 children in all between them. And she's a pretty patient mother. She travels to a building site to deliver her eldest son, Edward II, in Wales, in order to make him Prince of Wales. They are clearly very close. And I suppose, and what you say is true. Middle Ages, by the late 13th century, is doing very grand monuments, but these are different from funerary monuments in the sense that they're crosses, they're outside, they're not in churches, they are of a sophistication that it's possible that, this better than I do, probably, that they are following in the footsteps of a series of what are called Mountjoys in France, built in the 1270s for the death of a sainted French king, Louis IX, isn't it? And that this is a similar gesture being done very soon afterwards by an English king for his wife.
That's right. And but I like to think about King Edward. The problem with these crosses is we don't have lots of the records. We don't have much information about how they were actually built, or the instructions given. And so many of the crosses don't even survive, or, only a small remnants of them survive.
Only 3 actually survive.
Yeah, 3 survive, and then there's always
best in Geddington.
And the best in Geddington. Thank you, Clive. The Geddington rep is back in.
We have a scratched record beside us.
Alice, what did you conclude about Eleanor?
What did I conclude? I think John's right. Her story is absolutely amazing. Her life is amazing. And as John said, she was travelling around on crusades, and she was pregnant, and she was giving birth on crusade all that time. It's just remarkable to think about that. And we don't know exactly how many times she gave birth, but the number that is often given is 16, though many of those died. So she also faced a life of great personal tragedy, many children dying at a very young age, and also all of the children that we don't even know about, that weren't even recorded. But she also, she did acquire a lot of land, and you can see her, and some people did see her as being, I suppose, very greedy with that, or abusing other people's position. But actually, she's also this incredible businesswoman. And I wonder that if she had been a king or a male figure, people would have criticised her in such the same way. You could see her as this kind of Eleanor the feisty, Eleanor the formidable, Eleanor this great CEO that's very kind of hard-nosed about things.
It is what you did in the Middle Ages, isn't it? You just grabbed everything you could.
And I suppose also what she was doing is trying to solve a problem that other queens had faced, which was not having a secure income and not being secure in their financial needs. And she does do that, and that does set a precedent for being in quite a strong position for the queens that followed her. But I think, when we think about Edward I as well, he is he is seen as one of the great kings of the Middle Ages when you consider the medieval mind and the requirements of a medieval king. And she was his perhaps right-hand man in all of those matters. And so she's a great advisor of the Middle Ages and a great supporter in some of these. And the other thing to say, of course, is Edward and Eleanor inherited a very difficult kingdom. You know, they were pretty, people often look at them and with Wales and that being the hammer of the Scots and everything. But actually, Edward and Eleanor had grown up in a time of civil war, of terrible unrest, and most of what they were doing in their reign was trying to preserve the peace. And though that seems quite aggressive in our modern terms, it was actually seen as the number one priority, I suppose, of the medieval monarch.
Yes, you're quite right. I mean, you know, she grows up. I don't know how old she is. Is she sort of in her late 40s, just nearly 50 when she dies?
We think she's 49 is the number, yeah.
And she's already, as you say, I mean, married very, very young and then come to England at a time when the future Edward I is the eldest son of a king who's lost control of his kingdom. This is the time of de Montfort's rebellion. Henry III and the Prince Edward are for a period both imprisoned.
Imprisoned. That's a pretty extreme position to be in. And I think if you look at those younger moments of their life, how terrifying and unnerving that must have been. It's no surprise that he had a heavy hand later on.
You know, I mean, they're both formidable figures. And I mean, you have to acknowledge also that isn't it extraordinary that we're coming somewhere that isn't actually associated with her life to talk about her, that we're in Geddington to talk about it. It's not her tomb, she's not buried here, but, you know, Edward I has succeeded in capturing her memory in this spot through the monument.
This is what's so interesting about the book. I mean, in some ways it's a book about Eleanor, but I'm not really necessarily trying to persuade people to love or detest Eleanor. You know, she's just an interesting figure. And actually, this is a book more about her life and that legacy. I mean, the legacy of Edward immediately. There's this wonderful quote. He writes, in the months after Eleanor dies, or the weeks after, Eleanor, whom in life we dearly cherished, and whom in death we cannot cease to love. So it's this wonderfully romantic quote. And after that, within the next 5 years, he erects these monuments. And then from that, for years and years and years, there's this kind of legacy that is what I was trying to explore. And many of the crosses don't survive, so only 3 of 12 survive. But in so many of the towns that I walked through, so Stamford, Grantham, St Albans, Stony Stratford, there have been these murals or these memorials that have been erected in recent years. You know, in Stamford, there's this beautiful cross. It's a kind of modern cross. It's this kind of pointed needle, which is very modern in its look, but it is called the Eleanor Cross. And that was in the early 2000s, I think. So, you know, that's quite a remarkable thing that these are being built still. And in Stony Stratford, there's an entire wall of a building that is decorated with this mural of Eleanor, which is a kind of, you know, a nod to the cross that once stood there. So, and that was in 2019. Like, why are people all these years later still kind of, you know, keeping that legacy, not just maintaining the monument that's already there, but actually creating new
things,
bits to it? Yeah.
It is worth reiterating, is that, you know, there are 12 crosses. That's the number of the apostles. Numbers tend to be important in the Middle Ages. Quite likely that that's not a coincidence. The two most prominent and the most important are both destroyed, both in London. One in Cheapside, which is the main thoroughfare of the city of London. So Edward I is putting memory of Eleanor right in the commercial and, you know, heart of his kingdom on this main thoroughfare. The other, of course, which many listeners will be aware of by name at least, is Charing Cross. And in fact, the Charing Cross, the cross that's now outside Charing Cross Station is a Victorian recreation, I think designed by Barry, is that right? I mean, off the top of my head.
The younger Barry.
The younger Barry.
Yes.
And then, but in fact, the original situation of it, I think I'm right in saying, is where the statue of Charles I is at the head of Whitehall, which actually, as we've said on a previous podcast, is the point from which all measurements from London are taken. So the original Charing Cross is somehow also central. It's a shadow, casts its shadow on the way we see, you know, the capital and the measurements from the capital. Rather fascinatingly,
I suppose the decision to build a cross or to stop the cortège at Cheapside, where presumably there's a monastery, and at Charing Cross again. I mean, that was a calculated decision, so that these crosses would have, you know, extra symbolic value because they'd be in the centre of London.
It is the case. I mean, again, this is slightly from memory, Alice. You may correct me, but she's a great patron of the Dominican order. Her heart is buried with the Dominicans in London. The two things I think you mustn't miss out on, the crosses go up incredibly fast, and we're going to talk about their architecture when we go down and look at the cross at Geddington. But, they're begun in 1291, and they're being complete. So she dies in 1290. They're almost immediately being commissioned, clearly. The two other things that crucially happen, and people tend not to talk about them in relation to them, are first the tomb of Eleanor in Westminster Abbey, this copper-gilt tomb. It's absolutely astonishing thing with one of the most lifelike portraits of an English queen that exists anywhere, copper-gilt, life-size effigy of her. But also in 1292, Edward I begins building St. Stephen's Chapel in Westminster. And this is a chamber, the chapel that after the Reformation becomes the seat of the House of Commons. And it's one of the party pieces of English medieval architecture. And it seems to follow in exactly this process of these commissions. And many of the people involved in designing the crosses, crucially this figure called Michael of Canterbury, he is also probably the designer of St. Stephen's Chapel as Edward I redesigns it. That's also a copycat building of France, the Sainte-Chapelle on the Ile de la Cité, the palace chapel of the French kings. But in other words, these crosses sort of have they create a narrative in the terms of the journey, but they also sort of point to this. They're like an arrow pointing from Lincolnshire to the heart of London, to Westminster, the burial place of England's kings, and they're related and designed by the masons involved in the king's work. So there's a really interesting sort of grouping of monuments and events that you need to understand altogether.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really considered that exactly. I think also the centrality of the Charing Cross one is so interesting because, well, obviously today we see that as the central London point. Originally it was outside the city walls. So it's this monument on people's arrival to London. And it was known as Charing Cross because Charing is a bend in the river, not because there is a lovely tale that it's to do with Share Rain or, Dear Queen or something like that. But actually, that actually is not true. But lots of people think that. But it's a nice story nonetheless. But the interesting thing about that location, so it was on the point where the equestrian statue of Charles I now stands in front of Trafalgar Square. So that's where the original Eleanor Cross was. And London seems to have grown up almost all around it. Now, the Charing Cross was pulled down. This is another fascinating aspect of these crosses, is the way that they were destroyed. And so many monuments were destroyed in the Civil War. And these were pulled down. This was pulled down by Parliament as this kind of symbol of royalism, symbol of Catholicism, in an incredibly aggressive way. And in the years that followed, where this gap was, it was also on this point that some of the regicides of Charles I were executed. So
Clive is doing an approving thumbs up at this point.
Yeah. So
Judge Jeffreys.
But isn't that a symbolic thing that, this cross that has been this symbol of royalism for hundreds of years in the city that was pulled down is where they choose to, I suppose, make a public display of these regicides. And then the equestrian statue of Charles I that has been hidden underground was erected there as, again, this symbol of monarchy. So I suppose is the Charles I statue this continuation of the Eleanor Crosses. And then, of course, the fact that, as you say, the all of the measurements to London end up at that point. It's like the Eleanor Cross still is at the very centre of London to this day.
It's a fascinating thing. I suppose there's also one other really sort of prosaic thing to say about crosses. I mean, obviously, in the Middle Ages, there are crosses everywhere. But I think one of the ways we think of roads as clear ways where you drive along and they're empty. And of course, in the Middle Ages, there are crosses in all kinds of contexts, but they tend to be placed in the middle of roads. So they have a prominence. Well, but they have a prominence. Clive, you frivolous bastard. But they have a centrality which they just don't have anymore. I mean, where there are monuments, I don't know if another thing you may know is Lady Anne Clifford in the north of England, just outside Carlisle, when she erects a monument to the point on the road to London where she says farewell to her mother. And it's now sort of being moved to the side of So it's on the London Road, and she clearly erects this monument, and it's very prominent on the road. Now the road has become a 4-lane motorway, and this monument is sort of tucked away in a little siding with trees around it, and it symbolises for me the way in which things that were meant to be markers, prominent in the way, have now all been shoved to the side.
Interesting.
But in fact,
of course, in an age before maps, these would have been important, wouldn't they? Because you had to go by landmarks. And so they would have had an extra importance in the medieval landscape, I suppose.
And the landscape all the way to, really until the advent of, until the early 19th century, I think people begin to start clearing these things out of the way quite systematically as roads are improved and, you want, wider routes. But it is important to say that, these exist. These are sort of royal monuments, but they're, if you committed a murder, you might be told to erect a cross and then perform some, act of, penance. And so there will be, you still find them, little murder crosses, particularly in the continent, but I'm pretty certain there are some in the southwest of England, which are just little stones by the side of the road, and you might, easily miss them. Or obviously market crosses are not, and these are related to it, but there are many different kinds of crosses, and you could encounter them in all kinds of contexts, and in Mercat crosses in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and again these prominent things which in Edinburgh you can stand up on the base of the cross and make public announcements. So they are a great tradition, and so this is a sort of group of them with a very specialist. They're very unusual in form. As you've said, Alice, there's nothing that looks like them beforehand. And they are all connected with one narrative, and they are of royal, scale and decoration. I think that's an important point to make.
And is the... Sorry, did you...
Oh, I was going to ask, your experience of the journey. What was your experience of the journey today?
The great journey. So I made the journey. So Eleanor dies on the 28th of November in Harvey.
Oh, gosh, terrible time doing a journey.
Yeah. So it was winter. And then they take the body to Lincoln, and then it starts on the 4th of December, and then they basically make the journey down to London, and the funeral at Westminster Abbey is the 17th of December. So that's the kind of time scale. And those are I followed the days between them that they travelled on. So, it was absolutely amazing. It's the best part of 200 miles. So the first day from Lincoln to Grantham was about 27 miles. Oh. So quite a lot to walk in one day at the start. But then it's
How were they doing? In the Middle Ages, they had some sort of cart, and she was on a wheeled vehicle of some kind. And was everybody else walking? What were they doing? Do you know?
I think that's probably about, we don't know, but I have spoken to a few people who might know, historians and also kind of funeral directors. It's actually quite interesting talking to them about it, because we were discussing, like, would it be possible to carry a body like that a long way? And he, this one guy that I was talking to said, when you have a body, if you're taking a body even out to a graveyard, like where we are now, he said, even after 10 seconds, like you can really feel that weight. And he just thought it was totally implausible that people would carrying
it on their shoulders.
Yeah. But, perhaps some kind of cart, or cart sounds like a bit scruffy, but something a bit grander than that. And perhaps maybe, they might have carried her when they arrived at these places. We know at St Albans, for example, all of the people of the town, they came out to greet the arrival of the cortège.
Yes.
And perhaps they had these grander moments along the way where perhaps they did carry her in a kind of procession to St Albans. So every night along the way that she's kept in these, I suppose a vigil is kept in the kind of sacred place. And the thing is, we don't know exactly what happened, but we can make pretty good guesses. So in Stamford, there's a beautiful church, which I forget who it's dedicated to. Do you know the one? It's a beautiful, massive spire. But that's where we think perhaps her body might have lay. Or in Northampton, there was the Abbey, Delapré Abbey, and probably she was cared for by the women there. So perhaps at those moments she was carried in a different way. And actually, it was very interesting looking at the recent funeral of the Pope and how they carried his body, or they carried him on their shoulders through, outside St. Peter's Basilica. And I felt like lots of those processes would have been quite similar to what they would have done. And of course, the other interesting thing is thinking about the death of the recent Queen Elizabeth II and how they transported her body, and how, we had the
vigil and so on.
The vigil. I mean, I actually opened the book with going into Westminster when you could go and see, the bell.
We really are here.
Yeah. That's not a sound effect. But it's kind of interesting to look at these processes of how people are remembered, and I suppose we can only guess at what happened with Eleanor in lots of these cases. But actually,
did Edward
it would
make it
sense.
back and catch up?
So Edward,
was he leading it at any point?
Yeah. So to go back to your original question, yeah. So Eleanor's body was transported, and there would have been the royal household would have travelled with them, and Edward travelled. We think most of the journey. We think he went ahead at St Albans, perhaps to do business, to kind of, I suppose, keep government going.
So there would have been hundreds of people.
Yes.
Yeah, I think there would be a significant number, and it would have been. I think that's the other thing to say, that when Eleanor's body arrives at these towns, this is a huge moment for them, and it was a huge ceremony.
Yes.
And you can imagine all of the merchants in Stamford and Grantham dealing with wool and everything, or whatever they were doing at the time. But all of this business coming to a halt as the royal party move in.
And it is worth saying we do have descriptions, don't we, in fact, of later medieval funerals. I mean, her son, Edward II, when he's carried from Berkeley to Gloucester, we have a description of that. That is certainly on a cart. And Henry V, who dies in France, and again is carried on a great hearse. And so we have an awareness of that. I suppose one point that it does raise is, what exactly do the crosses mark? I mean, who chose where the crosses went? Because, I suppose we tend to think that the cross stands on the spot where her hearse rested, but in fact it doesn't at all. Presumably, indeed, the body is brought into the church here in Geddington, and then somebody says, where shall we put the cross? And
there was a bridge. There was a medieval bridge, or there was a crossing place. I'm not quite sure whether the bridge had been built.
Yeah, but I'm just making the point that there is no actual relationship between the precise position of the cross and what are they? What exactly are they?
Well, that's
exactly. No.
But then it raises the question of, what were the actual crosses for? I mean, were they just memorials to a queen in memory of Eleanor? Were they trying to encourage prayers to Eleanor's soul? Or was it even to encourage? This is what I was thinking as I was walking. Did Edward think about this as a kind of pilgrimage route, Lincoln to London? I mean, I don't know if that's feasible, but I was thinking about is it Hyde Park? I think there's the Princess Diana Memorial Route, which is a set of kind of circular shapes on the floor, and you're supposed to follow the route. And actually, I think that changes it quite a lot, because you then, as the mourner, become active, because it relies on you to be a part of it. Otherwise, the memorial isn't complete. Whereas, so it relies on some kind of walk. I don't know if it was a design like that, but it's interesting to consider.
I think we should go down and look at the cross.
I think you're absolutely right. Let us move down part 2. Thank you.
Welcome back to the second half of our YPOMPOD on Eleanor crosses, and we're standing in a very important position, which is the old garden gate to our little cottage. And we're looking at the Eleanor cross, and it stands at a junction of roads. And I'm not sure whether the roads were here, but it's certainly only about, less than 100 yards from the river, and the river had a ford in it. So people came up this way, and they would have seen the Eleanor Cross, which is a tall monument, and it's triangular, and it's distinguished by having 3 figures of the Queen on an upper level, and each one has a kind of column in front of it, because I think it's part of the mourning, because we can't really wholly see her. Anyway, Alice, take up the description paint a word picture for people who are listening.
You're doing so well, Clive. Yes, well, it's quite I'd say, it's a pretty imposing and large structure. The village of Geddington, lots of the buildings here are quite small. I mean, people would say it's tranquil and sweet, wouldn't you? It's a tranquil little picture-perfect village in many ways. And this, I'd say the Eleanor Cross really rises pretty high above the surrounding buildings. But yes, we've got this structure of steps at the bottom. How many steps are there? 1, 2, 3, 7? 7 steps, and that's hexagonal in shape. And then triangular.
The steps are still very much used because, nobody on them at the moment, but very often there are children here in the morning and afternoon, and then there are people coming out from the pub and drinking a pint of beer on them. I mean, it's still a tremendous focus of this little community.
No, it definitely is. And when I was walking here in December, when we came, it was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and there were so many little children running around, just come out of school, and we were sitting on the steps having a well-earned pint, which was well enjoyed, even in the midst of December. So it's really at the heart of the village. But I think, the key details which you see on these crosses, which, it's very interesting actually, the design, and John will be able to pick up on this, is that the 3 crosses that survive which are at Northampton and at Waltham Cross and at Geddington, are very different in their design. So it's not like, there was definitely not a set design of what they should be, but they do bear similar features, which are that they have the shields of Eleanor of Castile. So that's England, of Ponthieu, and of Castile and Leon. So those are the 3 shields that you see on her tomb and on the crosses. And it has these figures of Eleanor. And I think, it's worth saying that these statues themselves are quite amazing works of art in their own right. The drapery is pretty beautiful. And then it rises up to the top, and we think, some people have said that there'll be a cross at the very top, but we cannot be sure. John, take it away.
No, well, it is true. I mean, to have 3 figures it is very peculiar having these repeated figures of queens. It's a theme of all the crosses, and in this case, all 3 are still here. I mean, it's really remarkable, and you can see how easy a cross like this would be to overthrow. As Alice has already described. This is the simplest of all the crosses. You do need to, to understand its ingenuity, you do need to conceive of it in plan, which is how a medieval mason would have initially drawn it out. And as Clive has already said, there are hexagonal steps at the bottom, and in plan, the base of the cross then becomes a triangle. It's actually a slightly bowed triangle, because the other detail of this is that all the main faces of the cross are ornamented, they're covered in sculpture. There's not a sort of a flat stone face to be seen in this entire monument, except possibly at the very top where there are pinnacles. And notionally what it is a whole group of pinnacles crushed together in this triangular plan, with their faces at the lower level just covered in carving. And I suppose you need to think of carving in the Middle Ages as just a way of making something really expensive. You don't just have the money to cut a flat stone and make it all neat and beautiful and well jointed. You have enough money to carry on carving and make this beautiful flat stone ornamental in its own right. We don't actually know, again, from memory, I think this is one of the crosses where we have no documentation as to who is actually responsible. But we do know that the most important cross is built by this mason called Michael of Canterbury. It is worth just digressing briefly into his career. He's a master mason for Canterbury Cathedral. Of course, Canterbury is, the Archbishop of Canterbury are the principal figures in the English Church. And also for, I seem to remember, St. Augustine's Canterbury, the monastery, the great ancient monastery just outside Canterbury, established by St. Augustine when he converts the English. Michael of Canterbury, it's his first job. He's a skilled mason used in Canterbury, presumably where he comes from. His work on the Cheapside Cross, which is the biggest of all the crosses, is his first work for the king. But he's also then the mason that designs this chapel, as I mentioned before, at St. Stephen's Chapel in Westminster, which is itself encrusted with ornament. We know from the building accounts of the Cheapside Cross, I seem to remember, that it's painted. So we must also imagine this monument not just being of stone, which is what we see today, but certainly partly painted and coloured. I imagine, in fact, that the figures are certainly coloured, and it's possible that the decorative carving lower down is coloured too. One, as I say, it's a group of pinnacles all clustering upwards and coming almost to a point. It's over 40 feet high. It's very, very tall. Part of this whole procedure of burial is to do with display. And I suppose one of the functions is to make permanent the memory of a royal burial and the royal display. It makes that architecturally permanent. And the heraldry that Alice has spoken about, I mean, it's really interesting because the shields are notionally hung. If you look carefully, you can see above them little straps. So it's as though they've been hung on the monument. And again, those are presumably picked out in colour to give them prominence. So, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing.
It's very flat carving on the faces. It's quite unusual, isn't it, John? I mean, you get it in some cathedrals. It's rather like a reliquary.
Yes, I run the risk of turning this into a monologue. So the English are fascinated by French Gothic ideas, but they love ornament, and they crowd things with carving and ornament. As I said, it's a way of making it really rich. A really nerdy and peculiar detail of this monument is that the faces themselves, although it's triangular in plan, you have to understand that each face of that triangle is not merely carved with decoration, but it's not flat. It's actually moulded. It follows a slightly peculiar design. And these very deeply swept mouldings of the thing are something that is being used for the first time in English architecture. It's a kind of revolutionary idea about how you ornament buildings, these very broad mouldings and the ornamentation of them. And this incrustation of detail that you ask about first turns up on a really grand scale in the building begun by Edward I's father, Henry III, at Westminster Abbey. If you go to around the high altar at Westminster Abbey, you'll see that the walls of the church, none of the walls are flat. They are all carved with ornament. Every stone is carved with ornament. So again, it underlines the sort of stupendous expense of these objects. And I have to say, I think I'm right in saying that the Eleanor Cross in Cheapside cost something close to £300, about £290 or something. And that is an absolutely sensational sum of money in the 1290s. I struggle to think of what a parallel would be, but these are not cheap objects. You know, they are royal in cost, royal in ornament, royal in scale.
I suppose extraordinary that he was able to spare the king's masons, because he was building all the time, wasn't he? How extraordinary that these people could actually be spared from these other projects in order to build the crosses.
Well, indeed, he is building, of course, this is the period where he's still working on his castles in Wales, and it's just before his treasury is completely emptied by all his different wars. Yeah. So it's actually a kind of crucial catalytic moment in the history of English architecture, where you get these masons working, they're masons connected with the royal works, focused in Westminster, and they're doing really different and very exciting things in architecture. As I say, these do have a precedent probably in these Mountjoys erected in France in the 1270s, but in comparison to the Mountjoys, they're much, much more complicated structures, and that's English masons are fascinated by the idea that you can miniaturize architecture. You can, if you imagine a balloon and you draw a face on a balloon, and then you let all the air out of the balloon and you have that face sort of shrivels up, and then if you add a few more details to it when it's all shriveled up and then blow it up again, this is what masons are doing. They're expanding and diminishing these ideas, and in that expansion and diminution they create new ways of designing things. So here you can see all these miniaturized pinnacles, and the form of all these monuments is very close to things again St Stephen's Chapel. St Stephen's Chapel, rather like Battersea Power Station, has 4 massive corner turrets, each of which has a very complex pinnacle on top, and these are very like the pinnacles on that building, and of course they're designed by the same people.
I think it would also be worth just saying about Geddington. This seems such a small little village today. It's a beautiful place to live, I'm sure. It was, Clive. And it must seem strange to visitors today that this massive monument was built here. But actually, in the medieval period, there was a royal manor that was here on the site near the church. So this was actually somewhere that was visited by Eleanor and Edward several times. And
They knew it.
Yeah, so they knew the place of Geddington, and they would come here enjoy the hunting. I think at nearby Rockingham Forest. Is that
That's
nearby?
exactly, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Hunting forest.
So, and it's a strange thing that after the 1290s, the use of that manor, the manor falls out of use, and it doesn't survive for that many years. And the question is there something about Geddington that Edward just finds so, Edward has spent so much time with his family in such a happy way, and this beautiful cross has been built here. Can he just never return? Who knows? But there is for some strange reason, this no longer, exists as a centre for the royal family, which is
an odd shift, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a bit like Richard II, maybe, John.
And
Anna Bohemia.
When he's so bereft that he orders the manor she dies in to be destroyed. Yes, exactly.
Unusually happy marriage
Indeed.
of king and
Indeed.
queen.
And then another royal gesture of grief, this idea that you would totally destroy the building in which your wife died. Needless to say, his officials carefully demolished it and put all the pieces away for reuse somewhere else, which was rather less bereft and full of grief.
What doesn't the officials?
Yeah.
Quite possibly. I mean, it may well be. Should we just go and look right up close? Because I think it's sort of interesting to see. And
Take out our microscopes.
because, I mean, when you get up close, you can see much more clearly how it really isn't a flat surface. You have,
we are actually now mounting the steps.
and it's almost bowed, and you get, in fact, what is a sort of a flat area, which carved with foliage.
It's a bit late now.
But you have a moulding, what's called a wave moulding. It goes up and down, and then another flat surface, and then this sort of curious series of fillets, and then the same design with the wave repeated on the other side.
And repeating flowers.
They're just juicy. You can see that they're just, it is just filling this.
Well, people can probably read into all of these designs a lot, but Eleanor of Castile was very much into gardening, and she was very interested. She was very enthusiastic about developing gardens in all of the palaces that they had. So some people like to say that the flower motif is a reflection of that, although it might just be coincidental.
These moulding.
Feminine.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, whatever that means. I don't know.
Well, women often were in charge of gardens, weren't they? I mean, in households.
I have to completely sort of train-spottering comment, but this wave moulding is found in Edward I's castles. It's where it first appears, and you can see how it's a very sort of bold moulding. One of the things that Michael of Canterbury does in lots of his architecture, like the gatehouse at St Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury, is he has a sort of what you would call a hierarchy of mouldings, where the gateway itself is very austerely detailed, and then the building gets richer and richer as it rises up. It doesn't really apply in this case, but it's really interesting seeing him use what are completely new mouldings.
Where do you think the stone came from, John? Do you know?
I must say, I would have thought definitely locally.
So there is a site near Corby, which the stone is said to come from. So that seemed to be the most likely option.
Yes,
But I think what I loved thinking about in the book, which we can look at these buildings and these structures in these buildings, and this applies to all architecture really. That you see them as these finished designs, but I tried to bring alive the moments when this place was full of masons and full of, the carpenters and the kind of hive of activity that would have been here. I mean, it must have been quite an exciting thing for the people of Geddington to see, the little kind of hut that would have been set up to provide for them, and the sounds that would have echoed around this little space.
It's also really exciting, isn't it? I mean, I feel it's one of the things about being in Britain generally and in Europe generally is that you can stop in places like this that are not significant now and find completely astonishing things. And how privileged that we can still mount the steps of a 13th century monument.
I know, absolutely astounding. But of course, the act of building it, getting the stone on this very tall cross, getting the stone to the top, you would have had to have, what do you call them? Things to lift it up. Well, scaffolds, but also lift, probably with a sort of hamster wheel to with a pulley, and so you could get these big blocks
sort of
of stone
system,
up to the top. I mean, it's quite a thing to think about. As Alice was saying, so many people must have been involved.
And I think the fact that they must have done this quite quickly, which is impressive when we think about our building projects today, going on for years and years and years.
Yes.
Now, I have another theory to put to you, John, and Clive, as you're here. Is that when I was sitting in the pub, maybe after a few drinks that evening that I arrived in Geddington, and I was sitting in the Star Inn, and I was sitting in there's a little window there where I was looking out to the cross, and there was this a roofer who lives in the village, and he was telling me about the local history, and of course a great figure around here is Thomas Tresham.
Yes.
Who was responsible for another very famous triangular tower, which is not far from here, under 10 miles, is it?
Yes.
And also there are Treshams, I think, buried in Geddington village. So, Geddington churchyard. So, is that not a coincidence? Surely Tresham would have known about this cross and had it in his mind when he was building that triangular tower.
I think there can be very little doubt that he would have known. It does seem likely, doesn't it? Though when we're close to, you can also see it is just a bit more complicated than just being a triangle. Do you know what I mean?
It is.
Only John can point that out. Thank goodness we have him here to put us right.
It's a stone coming by.
Which is a brick supply being passing by. But it's worth pointing out that we're very close to Boughton as well. Another great house. And in Boughton there is a room which has a family tree which begins with Edward I. And I'm quite sure that the point of reference is this cross. It's sort of linking yourself to local history and the figures. I mean, most people trace themselves back to Edward III, but it's quite interesting that Boughton in this neck of the woods goes back.
Everybody's heard of Edward I.
And maybe the other legacy in terms of architecture that is interesting about the crosses is the great revival in the Victorian period. So the Charing Cross monument is a Victorian monument. And there are several kind of...
The Martyrs' Memorial in Oxford is another one, isn't it?
So it's this flowering of monuments, which draws back to the Eleanor Crosses, so the Martyrs' Memorial, and even outside the Royal Albert Hall, the Albert Memorial, though the design is very different, they did cite this great kind of tribute to a consort from history, the Eleanor Crosses, when they were building it.
That's really interesting, because I always think if it's Italian, I can see exactly why. Yes, it is the same sort of thing, isn't it? That's really interesting.
I think the point about Thomas Tresham was really interesting, because he's just the sort of person who would have wanted to identify with this, because for one thing, he liked very complex ideas, but he was a Catholic. And so the continuity with the past would possibly have been very important to him, and it's so close. I'd never thought of it before, but I think that's an interesting thing to explore.
And also, in the period of Tresham, which was late 16th century, early 17th century, there a lot of these crosses in London were becoming unpopular, shall we say, because of I suppose post-Reformation, the association with Catholicism, and so actually it was quite a statement to emulate something like the Eleanor Crosses at that point.
I mean, it is complicated. I think he certainly would have known about this, and I think it's very likely there's a connection. Of course,
John's sceptical.
Well, no, but
We'll work on it.
But I mean, he does have a 3-leaf clover as his emblem. He's the Trinity, which is why he cites these 3 points.
Oh, yes.
And has 3-point windows. So, but I mean, I think also that a lot of these kinds of iconographies are elusive. That is to say, people create them, and then if you were to say, is it symbolic in this way, and the person who built it would say, oh yeah, now you mention it, it is, because there's a connection between these ideas.
Well, you can read a lot about this. It's a lot. So as I was walking through,
there might have been a connection with the Trinity here.
I doubt it. I mean, the geometry of this is very significant. This is what makes it. The geometry. The architecture is imitating God's divine order, and therefore, by working in this geometry, you're creating an extension of divine order. And the geometry is important. But in a world where, if you'd asked the mason who designed this, is it symbolic of the Trinity? I'm sure he would have thought, oh, well, actually, now you mention it, it is. Yeah. But it's not that he was thinking of the Trinity when he designed it, if you see what I mean.
The geometry is a significant thing in all the crosses, I think. And I was thinking about this when I was here. It's in the very centre of this little village. So much seems to revolve around this structure. And if I was making a Doctor Who episode, I think that this would be like the thing that would turn back time. You know, it's kind of got that quality.
That quality. And just going back to this thing of other things, other monuments on thoroughfares. I mean, in London itself, there you can still see, can't you, just outside, is it Fenchurch Street Station, the London Stone, this stone which has now been shoved to one side within a building in a niche. But I mean, it's been in London since at least the 13th century, and it was like the stone of Troy. Do you remember both Troy and Rome have these stones that if the stones are ever removed, the city will tumble, and it has a very, very prominent place in medieval London, again on a major thoroughfare, and it's moved to one side in the 18th century, and it's never, most people wouldn't even notice it. This idea that these things are not tucked away, they're really prominent, and what you're describing as this, centre of life, I feel they are focus.
Well, like the Charing Cross, London has revolved around that spot and on Charing Cross at Trafalgar Square, and it still does to this day. It's got this kind of magnetism, I feel, and I feel like you feel the magnetism here in Geddington.
It's interesting, you can turn this way and you see the bridge, which is an ancient medieval bridge, but I think later than 13th century, isn't it, John?
I think it is a medieval bridge. I don't know.
It is, and it's got those places you stand in to get away the.
Is that Cutwaters?
Yes, with the projections.
The triangle.
Clive ignored the bridge. He steamed through the ford when we came here, throwing water to either side.
With no hesitation. But it's interesting that quite an elaborate bridge should be built here too.
Well, that's a reflection of the standing of Geddington in the medieval period. It was an important place. There was a special permission to have a market here. So it's you can't think about it as a little village.
Is this the marketplace, in fact? It must be, mustn't it?
Well, it must be. I mean, there's the bridge. We can see the bridge and we can see the church, and it's quite a small place in some ways. I mean, it must have been just in front of where we're standing now.
It's what you might call a square, except it's triangular. Well, I'm sorry to be saying goodbye to Geddington. Having become rather emotional about it, but we are so lucky to have had Alice to join us and to help us understand this great monument. So thank you, Alice.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Great
well, thank you so much for having me. It's been very enlightening.
It's been very, very fun for us.
And we look forward to the book.
Okay, Clive and
the sound of the horses.
There's some horses who have just come along for the final moment of this podcast.
And medieval authenticity.
Yeah. Like to do things properly here. And Clive and John have both forgotten how you're supposed to end a podcast, but I'm going to say it for them. Make sure to leave a review, 5 stars. Please. I'd recommend it myself. But thank you so much for listening, and there's many more exciting episodes to come. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.